Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. I'm here with a little chat on how the American neoclassicists got screwed in concert. Now, as some of you may know, at least if this isn't the year, 3785, I've been doing a series in fabulous concert programs on American neoclassicists. Wonderful, wonderful composers who wrote fabulous works, including a slew of pithy, delicious symphonies, which ought to be played regularly because they're generally short, they're tuneful and attractive, they're full of vim and vigor, they're exciting. There's no reason not to play them, but they don't get played. Partly it's because of the conservatism of, concert promoters and organizers and conductors who don't know the music and maybe audiences. I'm not sure. I tend to think audiences are probably far more open-minded than most musicians. But beyond that, some interesting things happened in the second half of the 20th century because most of these pieces were written between, say, 1900 and 1950. That's when, the height of the neoclassical period was. And I think that we should just, consider that for a moment because it's very interesting, actually, kind of ironic when you think about it. What happened? Well, the neoclassical period, or neo-romantic, neo-whatever, involved, composers writing wonderful orchestral works that were, generally speaking, rather short, rather audience-friendly, even though they were modern in terms of harmony, in terms of rhythm, just not out there modern, like atonal or avant-garde modern, but otherwise they were contemporary, and people like contemporary. One of the things that has always fascinated me is that in the classical music world, people want to hear something that's 200 years old. But if they go to see a movie, or if they listen to commercials, or if, the music that we hear in our daily life is contemporary, and we like it. It's our music. And so there's no reason why symphonic music in that style or using something of those idioms should not be popular too. There just isn't. And I don't think it's true that it would not be popular. But in any case, so they wrote these wonderful pieces. And, one of the things that I've always said about the symphonic revolution, about the orchestras, that the great era of the symphony was the 20th century. It wasn't before because orchestras didn't exist. But what happened was, by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, most major cities and many minor cities had very, very good symphony orchestras. They commissioned works. There were orchestras available and composers willing to write for them. And so this huge repertoire existed, just like there was a huge repertoire of harpsichord music in the 18th century. The instruments were there, the performers were there, and the repertoire was written. So we have lots and lots of music, and it was played at least once, but maybe not twice. Why didn't it get played twice? Well, here's the kick. Blame Mahler and Bruckner and those people. Why? Because after about 1950, we began to catch up with the generation of composers who were gone, who were dead, who wrote big, huge, late romantic, grandiose works, grandiose symphonies. The Mahlerian concept of the symphony, this big, eclectic, all-embracing universe of music that can take an entire program just to play one of them. Well, that became enormously popular. Nobody's more popular now than Mahler. Bruckner is fast catching up, even though I personally believe that he's not really all that popular when it comes to audience appeal. Certainly on records, they're making Bruckner like crazy, but my experience has been that orchestras don't like to play it, and people can take it or leave it. But it doesn't matter because they're playing the crap out of it. And why? Because these are these big, huge symphonies that fill up a whole program. And there are other composers from that period, too. There was Elgar and his two symphonies, which make hour-long symphonies popular in the UK. And, of course, Brahms, for all that people talk about how conservative he was, his symphonies are large works. At least numbers 1 and 2 and sort of 4 are. And so they're popular too. And so the idea of the symphony as the thing that has to go on the second half of the program to fill up the whole second half, that it's become ossified. embedded in our consciousness of what orchestral programming is, particularly these days. You have the overture of the concerto with a big famous soloist. And if the soloist is really famous, they get the second half all to themselves. And then you have, the big symphony after the intermission. It's so easy. It's so mindless. Nobody has to think about it. And there's this huge repertoire of big symphonies. And if you want to do a really big one, you do a big Mahler symphony all by itself. And you're in business. There's no room for anything else. Nobody wants to think about anything else. And so these wonderful neoclassical composers who wrote music that was crowd-pleasing, that was designed exactly to specifications, to be something easily programmable, something that orchestras would learn to do that wouldn't suck up all the rehearsal time with just one work. They did everything they could do. And they were aesthetically true to themselves. I mean, this was a real aesthetic movement, the neoclassical movement, of course. They got screwed because you can't program them now. What are you going to do with them? Where are you going to put it? If you start with one, well, they're a little too long for an overture, and you do have to rehearse them. You have to work at them. They take a little bit of effort. Even somebody as famous as like Albert Roussel, who was one of those great neoclassicists as he became later. His third symphony, well, you may hear it once every billion years. It's about 25 minutes long. His fourth, even shorter, no one touches it. It's impossible to fit it in. And so it doesn't get done. And it would take away from the concerto, which comes next. You don't want to work, which is going to overpower the concerto, particularly if it's one of those somewhat uninteresting classical concerti. And I mean uninteresting timbrally. See, here's the thing. Here's the other thing that really sort of gets me. Like I said, the great era of symphonic composition was the 20th century, the late 19th and 20th centuries. And that's because the orchestras existed, and the orchestras were much bigger and more colorful than they were in the classical period, in the days of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. However, we're supposed to worship Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, aren't we? And so if you do something like, let's say, Roussel's Third Symphony or Fourth Symphony, and you put it first on the program, then you do a Mozart piano concerto. Well, the fact of the matter is you've had this enormous, colorful orchestra playing the crap out of a big, colorful 20th century symphony full of celestes and harps and percussion and stuff. And then you got a Mozart symphony or a Mozart concerto or a Mozart something written for 12 people. And it diminishes the thing that we're supposed to worship. And frankly, classical performers prejudice programming to favor these colorless classical works. And I love this music. I adore it. But we're talking about contrast, right? We're talking about contrast within a single program. I've spoken about this before. I remember how horrible it was when Haydn came with the Concertgebouw, and they did a program that consisted of Dawn on the Moskva River, Shostakovich's Sixth, Intermission, Schumann 2. Now, Schumann's orchestration is never anything to write home about, even though the Second Symphony is one of his better efforts, for sure. But after Shostakovich's Sixth, do you want to hear Schumann 2? I mean, come on. There's just the range of tone, of volume, of timbral interest. They're miles apart. But the Schumann got solo billing on the second half. Why? Because it was the German symphony. And God forbid you should end the concert with something colorful and rousing and humorous. And, no, you had to have the German symphony. And the performance of the Schumann, aside from being drab for itself, it was just a drab performance. It really was. Haydn's Schumann sucked. But beyond that, the sound, in contrast, after hearing the Shostakovich, was so telling. I walked out. So did a bunch of other people, because it was just a snooze fest. And the fact of the matter is that compared to a lot of these marvelous neoclassical works that are brilliant and fabulously scored, some of the traditional stuff is going to sound pretty drab and long and hectoring even, perhaps, and monochrome. And it's a bad contrast. It's difficult to program these well, hence my fabulous concert program series, which hopefully will explain, at least to some enterprising listeners and conductors, how it might be done. But I think that the irony of all of this is that the growth of these grandiose symphonies written for today's enormous orchestras, comparatively speaking, has made it very, very difficult for these wonderful composers to get a fair hearing. And I just wanted to throw that out there because I just think it's ironic and I think it's a little sad, but I also think it's true. I think that that's what's been going on. And of course, imaginative programming will always resolve the problem. It's not insurmountable, but it requires a little bit of thoughtfulness on the part of conductors and orchestra managers and musicians. And I think the audiences are fine. They're going to come anyway. They're willing to listen. I believe that. But the musicians, they're the problem. They really are. They don't know the music, and they don't know how to play the music in the most effective way. That's my theory. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.